Hi everyone and welcome back to Heimler's History. So Thomas Jefferson was elected to a second term for president in 1804, and it was during his second term and into James Madison's first term that a little storm started brewing around here that eventually would lead our toddling nation into war, namely the War of 1812, which is a war that almost no American citizen can remember anything about except the fact that it occurred in 1812 because it was called the War of 1812. But the reason we're going to talk about such a popularly forgettable war is because of the great consequences it had on our growing nation. So let's begin in the beginning. Let's get to it.
It's time to kick it old school.
During this time, France and Britain were at war, because France and Britain are at war like every other weekend in world history. But remember, the US has a pretty strong policy of non-involvement in European conflicts. But even with that policy, the good news is that American merchants were getting filthy rich by trading with both France and with Britain. And as it turns out, neither Britain nor France was all that fond of the United States schmoozing its enemy. So France declared that any American merchant ships that entered into British territory would be forthwith destroyed. And not to be outdone, the British then declared that any American merchant ships entering French territory would be forthwith destroyed. And that was annoying to the Americans. It would be kind of like having two friends who are in a fight, but you still like both of them, and they both say to you, hey, if I see you at his house, I'ma shoot you. But even though it was annoying, it was not enough to drag America into their war. But worse than this was the British impressment of American sailors. British whatment? Impressment. On a pretty large scale, the British Navy men were impressing American sailors into their service. Now, the word impressment doesn't mean that the Americans looked at the British and were like, man, that's a nice boat. Where'd you get that boat? Impressment was the act of clobbering an American sailor upside the head and then forcing them into the service of the British Navy. The British started capturing all these Americans and saying, you know what, y'all's War of Independence was only like 50 years ago, so y'all are basically British. Yeah, you're gonna fight for us. Now, this practice, understandably, deeply angered the Americans at home. The British might as well have taken our national honor, made a fire hydrant out of it, and set it up in an alternate universe where dogs ruled the world. So it's right about now that James Madison is elected president, and he finds himself contending with a bunch of young guys in the Congress who were known as the War Hawks, and they wanted to fight. But we can't paint these war hawks with a single brush. They were equal opportunity warmongers. Not only did they want to get into a war with France, but they also wanted a war with the Indians, who were selfishly resisting American westward migration across the Alleghenies. But the Indians united under the leadership of a fierce chief named Tecumseh, and under that leadership they resisted the American settlers. But the Americans came against them powerfully at the Battle of Tippecanoe, routing the Indians, and that led to the Indians basically saying to Britain, hey white people, when the time comes, we want to help you white people kill those white people. To which the British responded, okay. So the British began sending arms to hostile Indians to do battle with the Americans. And this was the tipping point for Madison. Even though America was a young republic and very unskilled in the art of war, Madison decided that it was time for this little plumpling to stand up and flex its muscles. On June 1st, 1812, Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war, which they granted to him, but not overwhelmingly. In fact, there was a large contingent of Federalists who deeply opposed this war. Now, that little tidbit is going to be important, so take it, put it in your pocket, we'll get back to it later. Now, we're not going to get into the battles and the details of this war, but needless to say, our offensive strategy was not the best. However, there were some rousing moments, including the battle on the Great Lakes of Michigan, in which Oliver Hazard Perry captured the British fleet after a furious battle. Wait a minute, is his middle name really Hazard? That sounds like a pickup line. Oh, Mr. Perry, that battle sounds positively hazardous. Huh. Girl, my middle name is Hazard. And as it turns out, it's not a pickup line. That's his real middle name. There was also the Battle of New Orleans, in which future President Andrew Jackson manhandled the British forces in a surprise victory. And this launched Jackson into a national hero status and produced a giant wave of patriotism that swept through the country. But the British handled the Americans too. It was actually Tsar Alexander of Russia, of all people, who said, hey, can y'all stop fighting? Napoleon was pushing hard into Russia, and Alexander was tired of watching his British ally wasting resources fighting the stupid Americans and not fighting the stupid French. So they all gathered together in Belgium and signed the Treaty of Ghent, which basically said, we're going to stop fighting. It neither awarded territory to the Americans nor awarded territory to the British. In fact, they both basically got nothing. It was just a ceasefire agreement. And at the news of this, Americans beamed with pride because it was the second war in a row that they didn't, lose. And this sparked a fervent sense of nationalism because, hey, we're the kind of nation that takes up arms and resists any blow to our national pride. Now, I said we'd come back to the Federalists, and now is the time that we're going to pronounce the funeral oration over this party. They so opposed this war that in 1814 they got together in something called the Hartford Convention. And at the Hartford Convention, they decided that their respective states would secede from the Union and create their own little Fedtopia in the Northeast. But once the war was won, and the general feeling in America was that this was a good and honor-bearing conflict, the Federalists seemed way too out of touch with the people, and so they eventually died out. So this newfound sense of national pride was probably one of the most significant consequences to emerge out of the War of 1812. Now, all of a sudden, instead of just focusing on our own states and what was best for them, we began looking at the Union as a whole and desiring to invest in it. An example of this came from Congressman Henry Clay, and he was known as the father of the American system. And the American system had three main parts. Number one, a strong banking system which would provide easy and abundant credit. Number two, a tariff which would protect American industries which had been born during the war. And number three, the building of roads and canals, especially in the Ohio Valley. Now, some of this was implemented and some of it was not, but that's not what's important. What's important is to understand that America began to see herself in a brand new way. Previously, we had been the United States of America. Now, all of a sudden, we were America. I'll see you next time.